welcome shareholders and interested potential shareholders to the new Race Oncology. My name is Phil Lynch. I joined Race in June 2020 as a non-exec director and was fortunate to be appointed the CEO and Managing Director from September. Of course, joining me today will also be Dr. Daniel Tillett. Daniel, I think, is known well to many of you, but Daniel in his Chief Scientific Officer capacity and also as an Exec Director will be sharing the stage with me today, and he'll be talking much more in detail about the science and the opportunities that we have as we present our new strategies. Importantly today, we're talking about the new Race Oncology, and I want to highlight the new because today we're pivoting to some degree towards what we call precision oncology. And I hope by the end of this presentation it becomes very clear why we're choosing, if you like, that positioning and that pivot in strategy. So 2020 has been a really special year for Race Oncology, and it's been a year of highlights. And certainly the highlight in June was the release of the Israeli AML results. So we had a 40% response in a 10-person trial in acute myeloid leukemia, and that's a significant result. It exceeded our expectations, and we were pleased to share that data with the market. What it reminds us of, though, is that bisantrene has a special track record, a historical track record that I think confirmed that even in today's environment, it still is a very relevant drug in a chemotherapeutic setting, and that trial was instrumental in proving exactly that. We were also fortunate that we got another result, public domain, that came out of the City of Hope in Los Angeles. That was around the fat and obesity mass protein, which you'll hear much more about today. It's called FTO, but it's particularly important and it's really being instrumental towards our strategy pivot that we'll focus on today. Thirdly, we appointed CCSA, a regulatory advisor in the US. Many of our programs require us having a deep understanding of FDA processes, approval insights, and ultimately helping us to make good commercial judgment about what to proceed and progress. So CCSA is important, they're engaged, and they're already helping us, and you'll hear some of what we're doing today around why we're, if you like, altering and making different choices about what will progress strategically. And finally, in November, we published preclinical results from the University of Newcastle against breast cancer, preclinical, which proved that bisantrene as an anthracycline still has competitive properties and performance against standard of care. We expected that to be the case. It's been confirmed, so it gives us confidence that we can progress our breast cancer program, that again, we'll say more about. So when you think about those many changes in 2020, and we've been pleased to share them with investors through the year, it gave us cause to pause, reflect, and think about, well, what should we be doing differently? The 5-pathway strategy, if you tuned in a year ago, you would have heard about the 5 pathways. That's being instrumental to our progress and planning. But today we're pivoting and we're informed by the external environments that I shared. We're informed by an understanding of M&A transactions in the oncology marketplace, and equally the board undertaking an assessment about how do we create value for shareholders and of course patients down the road. So with that, we're pivoting, as I said before, to being a precision oncology agent. We still have a differentiated chemotherapeutic, but we feel in FTO and in precision oncology a greater opportunity. So strategy will now pivot and to take advantage of that opportunity. When we think about our assets and our intellectual property, we're clear that there are 3 that are very special to making us successful, both to date, but importantly in the future. And certainly it starts with the drug. So we talk about the 3 heroes. The first hero is the drug, bisantrene. The second, the team, both the board and the executive team, and our extended network of advisors. And thirdly, what we'll talk about today, importantly, the 3-pillar strategy. So to start with the drug, bisantrene, the drug, I touched earlier, but I'll say it again, particularly for new viewers to our business and to bisantrene. This is a chemotherapeutic drug. It has a long track record and history of, towards 30, 40 significant clinical trials. It was approved for sale in France, although never commercialized. It has a orphan drug indication in the US. It's got 4 patents, and we've successfully manufactured the drug. So we have so many things in place that give us confidence that we've got the drug in the right place. It's a therapeutic drug. We understand its activity, its mechanism of action, and we know it's got an established safety and efficacy profile. So that's a big advantage to have starting up. But secondly, you need the right people, and we've got a great board in place. Dr. John Cullity, our chair, who's got a transactional background, a pharmaceutical background, and John's had an association with race that exceeds, of course, over this year. Equally, Dr. Daniel Tillett, who many of you would know, but you'll hear more from in a minute. So Daniel's extremely well qualified to speak to the science, the insight, and therefore the opportunities that this strategy includes. Dr. Borrie Anderson, Professor Borrie Anderson from the MDA Anderson Oncology Center in the US. So Borrie's got a particular expertise in acute myeloid leukemia and particular insights in transplants that are being a successful strategy in helping patients through their journey. As you also think beyond the board and the executive team, we've got an extensive network of advisors. The beauty of us being small is that we only pay for advice, and we only secure advice when it's the best available, when it meets our needs, and when we can pay a competitive price for it. So we go globally, we operate globally to access the best in field to help us get our programs well executed, and equally to make sure we're going after the right opportunities. So I won't talk to you about this large network of advisors, but it is large, it's highly expert, and they're the right people, and we bring them in at the right time. But the real hero today, and what I want to talk about, is the 3 pillars strategy. And it starts with, frankly, an assumption. So we take a view that our ambition for race oncology is that we will ultimately create value, and more value than we have, by partnering ultimately with a pharma company. It could be through a sale, it could be through a license, potentially a partnership. But we're working with that ambition in mind, because the only way to get bisantrene to patients and create value for them, and frankly shareholders, is to work with a large pharma who is scaled, that has the regulatory expertise and the global reach to take bisantrene where it can go. And it's important now that we frame strategy with that in mind. So what we've done in Pillar 1 is redefined what's our priority. And we've got 3 priorities, but I'll say to you that Pillar 1, our FTO priority, is our largest. It includes the biggest opportunity. It's transformational in value and for patients, because it's going to work, as you'll hear from Daniel, across solid tumor oncology. So it moves us out of AML and blood type cancers, where we've been traditionally strong, but it takes us to a much larger playing field. And we think, based on everything we know so far, that it's a significant opportunity. And you'll hear Daniel talk about how we'll go after that opportunity, particularly with an early focus on melanoma and renal cell carcinoma. So that's the exciting part, and you'll hear much more about it. It's important you hear about it, because it is a pivot for our business, and it transforms where we play in the future. Pillar 2, we've defined as breast, and a focus against breast cancer. A very large indication. We know that breast cancer survival rates continue to improve, but there is still need. There are patients still dying from breast cancer, and bisantrene has a unique role in a chemotherapeutic setting. We know it's competitive in efficacy to standard of care, but it has an advantage in being more heart-friendly. And chemotherapy for vulnerable patients is risky, and unfortunately does cause damage, or causes patients to not undergo chemotherapy because of that risk. So our differentiated chemotherapeutic will allow us a positioning in breast cancer that is both high value but important for patients. Pillar 3 is, if you like, a more legacy or traditional setting for our drug. So I'm talking about acute myeloid leukemia. We've got opportunities to build on our Israeli results from June of 2020 and look at adult populations again, but in combination therapy with other drugs that, in combination with bisantrene, can elicit a significant or a more significant response than we already had as a single agent. Equally, we have that opportunity in a pediatric setting. We'll talk later about the PRV, or Priority Review Voucher, where if we can deliver a pediatric clinical result against a genetic subtype, we have the opportunity to get a drug registration in the US with the FDA, which importantly would allow us the opportunity to be awarded a priority review voucher. I'll mention those have commercial values of circa $80 to $200 million, depending on the year and who's in the market buying them. But that's a significant opportunity for us. Equally, not forgetting the 5 pathways, because we have legacy work in MRD, measurable residual disease, and equally in ovarian. So we've got work that we're progressing in those spaces, but Pillar 3 is so rich, capitalizes on our legacy setting, that we're going to do an exercise in feasibility to understand what are the priorities, what are our richest opportunities, and where will we focus in Pillar 3. The enablers to all of that program you can see on the slide, but really they are our pre-clinical and clinical programs. Of course, the collaborators we work with globally, and many of them in Australia, I should say, because of the important opportunities the Australian government provides through the 43.5% R&D rebate. Our regulatory expertise, our expertise in manufacturing, intellectual property, and of course, commercializing this business with an expert board and advisors. So that's the 3-pillar strategy. What's important now is that I introduce Daniel and allow Daniel to take you through the details so that you can understand and appreciate the science that gives us the confidence to believe that we're transforming this business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil, for that introduction. I'll bring to you something that is an amazing discovery for RACE, something that we didn't actually have anything to do with, but which basically landed in our lap unexpectedly in June of this year. And that was the identification that bisantrene is a potent inhibitor of the FTO protein. And I'm sure, like many of you, like myself, I'd never heard of FTO before, but once I started learning about what FTO offered, I became extremely excited. So excited, I couldn't actually stand still when I was reading the paper that came out of the City of Hope. And it really does offer us an opportunity to take bisantrene to the next level. Bisantrene has, as Phil mentioned, a great deal of historical data as a better chemotherapeutic, and now it has the ability to be used as a precision oncology, a low dose, non-toxic, targeted to particular cancers, but in the case of FTO, targeted to a very wide range of cancers. I'll talk about that in the next slide. So what is FTO? FTO stands for fat and obesity associated protein, and it's a central player in one of the key pathways that's been discovered in the last 10 years in cancer development. And that is in the way that genes are converted into proteins at the RNA level. There's a regulatory process known as RNA epigenetics or RNA methylation that controls which genes in the cell get converted from, get produced as proteins. And changes in the level of methylation on RNA determine which of those genes take place. There are a whole series of genes, as you can see here on the left-hand side of the slide, that control which genes become methylated, or which RNA transcripts become methylated. But there are only 2 genes that are involved in removing the methylation process. And the regulation involves adding methyl groups, removing methyl groups, depending upon the requirements of the cell. When this process goes wrong, cancer is one of the most common outcomes from this. And so what turned out to be is that FTO, many people have been working on this as they realise this is a key protein in controlling this, and they've discovered that FTO overexpression or underexpression, which is either producing more or less of the FTO protein, can drive cancers or lead to the development of cancers across a really wide range. And in fact, every single cancer that people have looked at for FTO has had a role in the development of that, at least a subtype of those cancers. So for example, breast, lung, ovarian, gastric, melanoma, pancreatic, kidney. There's yet to be one that I've looked for that I haven't been able to find at least a subset of those that are there. So as a consequence of this has become incredibly exciting and what would be considered a hot area in oncology. This is all fantastic. We now have a drug that targets this particular gene that everyone wants to have one for, And it's one that's been through clinical development. It's been tested in almost 2,000 patients in over 40 clinical trials. And it gives us a huge advantage over some of the other drugs that are being developed at the moment in preclinical. The big problem with developing a targeted agent drug is that you need to be able to show that your drug works before you can design a clinical test for it. So even though we might happen to think that if you overexpress FTO, that you're going to end up with being a target for using the use of bisantrene, you need to be able to prove that. And this creates a bit of a chicken and the egg problem, where you have to be able to collect data first to show that the FTO is an important target and that bisantrene actually does target that pathway. But you can't collect that data until you've actually run the clinical trial. And so you end up with this problem of how do you get the data because you're not allowed to run the trial until you have the data. And so the solution to this problem is to identify a cancer that has a reasonably high percentage of those cancers overexpressing. So you ideally want between sort of 50 and 90% of the cancers of that cancer type overexpressing your target. And then you run a general trial in that population. And then you go back and you look and see which of the cancers responded or which of the patients' cancers responded. And if it turns out that all the patients that had FTO are the ones that responded and all those that were not overexpressing FTO didn't respond, then you've got yourself an ideal targeted agent. After an extensive search through all the different possible cancers, and I think I have a list of 48 different cancers that this could be used in, it turned out that the two best ones to achieve these aims were melanoma and clear cell renal carcinoma, which I'll talk about next. So in melanoma, it's obviously an extremely important cancer. It's still a very deadly cancer. The 5-year survival rate, even with all the breakthroughs in treatment, for example, the checkpoint inhibitors or the BRAF and MEK inhibitors, still has quite a relatively few people, only 25% of people are still alive after 5 years. And the reason why is that melanoma is very difficult to treat and very resistant to treatment. And it's also very common for cancers that initially respond to treatment to no longer respond anymore. And so it's been a huge area. And obviously for those of us in Australia, we're very familiar with the problems of melanoma. It is, if you're going to think about an Australian cancer, melanoma would be it. And so there are still a major need for improved treatment options. Interestingly, with FTO, a preclinical study that came out of Chicago last year identified that inhibiting FTO, they didn't actually have a drug to do this, but they had genetic tools that allowed them to actually study this. They identified in a preclinical model that if you inhibit FTO, that you bring back the sensitivity to the major new breakthrough drug, the checkpoint inhibitors. So these are the Keytrudas, PD-1 monoclonal antibodies. And you can overcome this resistance to PD-1 inhibitors. And this is actually a really amazing opportunity here in that we can actually take patients that either didn't respond initially to treatment or responded to treatment but the cancer came back. We may be able to rescue those patients and provide them with another opportunity for treatment. So it's a great opportunity there in itself. The second opportunity is in clear cell renal carcinoma. This is a cancer that many people are not familiar with, but it's the 10th most common cancer that's identified. And it's basically a kidney cancer with a particular subtype. And it's driven by a particular gene called the von Hippel-Lindau gene, named after two German doctors, who identified that this particular gene is involved in preventing the occurrence of cancer. So when you have mutations in this gene, the VHL gene, you end up with getting cancer, and in this particular case, kidney cancer. Turns out that a group working in Stanford did a big study where they looked at all the genes in the body to try and identify if there are any genes that if they inhibited those genes, the product of those genes, that they would kill cells that had an inactive VHL gene. This is known as synthetic lethality. And when you get an opportunity like this can be a very powerful way of treating cancer. And in breast cancer, there was a similar discovery made with BRCA1 mutation, which is a major cause of inheritable breast cancer. They found that another series of genes called the PARP1 genes, if you have an inhibitor to PARP1, it becomes synthetically lethal in breast cancer. And it's been one of the big breakthroughs recently in breast cancer has identified this. So they identified that that FTO, if you downregulated FTO or inhibited FTO, that you would cause the VHL minor cells, those without an active VHL minor cells, to die. And that really provides us an opportunity to do something similar to what was done in breast cancer with BRCA1 and PARP1 inhibitors. And this is an amazing opportunity. And the great thing about this, in this particular cancer type, over 90% of the clear cell renal carcinomas have this mutation, the VHL gene. So it means in principle, up to 90% of all of the cancers should be sensitive to this treatment. These are two great opportunities to do proof of concept trials to try and prove out that FTO is a clinically relevant target. Next slide. So what's the next steps with FTO within Pillar 1? It's to take and do proof of concept trials that will allow us to identify that and prove or show that FTO is a clinically relevant target. There's a lot of preclinical work, there's a lot of epidemiological work that suggests that FTO is very important, but there is no clinically relevant data, and one of the reasons for this is there's been no drug. So no other companies out there have a drug ready to be used in the clinic to identify this, and we happen to have such a drug. Amazing opportunity. So what we will be doing is we'll be doing preclinical studies starting in early 2021 with an aim to complete before the end of 2021 to show that bisantrene in these particular cancers actually works like the genetic tools have shown. And there's a lot of reason to think this would be the case. And that would then allow us to have the preclinical data that will allow us to go into the clinic and test bisantrene in melanoma in combination with a PD-1 inhibitor, say like Keytruda, or on its own for renal cell, clear cell renal carcinoma, and see whether those patients respond. So it's a massive opportunity there. If we manage to achieve that, it allows us to open up a trial targeted towards FTO, and these are known as basket trials. This is where you allow any patient that is overexpressing FTO to enrol, and that opens up the opportunity to test bisantrene in breast cancer and lung cancer and gastric cancer and all the different cancers where FTO is important. We can do a trial in those as a group, and ultimately, if successful, this would allow you to have an approval to any cancer that happens to overexpress FTO, which is a very large target. So this is the exciting new pillar, Pillar 1. Pillar 2 builds upon our data that we've developed in-house and the historical data. There's still a large need for breast cancer treatments, particularly around the conventional treatment, the conventional chemotherapeutics. It's become increasingly recognised as a problem with damage to the heart of patients given chemotherapeutics, particularly those given anthracyclines or those given some of the newer monoclonals like Herceptin, and those patients going on to be cured of their cancer and then dying later on of heart failure. And from the patient's perspective, that's not necessarily a great win. You really want to be able to treat patients, cure them of their cancer, and not leave them debilitated with heart failure and a slow, painful death. We ran a preclinical program in breast cancer to identify whether bisantrene in combination with the common drugs that are used in chemotherapeutics these days will work and will work the same as the current drugs that are used. And we were very lucky well, I guess we were kind of expecting this, but we were very gratified to find that that bisantrene works basically identically to the existing drugs, but without the heart problems. And this allows us to move potentially into a clinical program where we replace the more dangerous versions of the chemotherapeutic agents, so the anthracyclines like doxorubicin or epirubicin, with a safer version, ultimately providing the patient with a better outcome. The next step for us in 2021 is a proof of concept trial in breast cancer to actually show that this is the case. So we'll be going back into the clinic with bisantrene. It has been in breast cancer extensively in the 1980s and 1990s. There was a large phase 3 clinical trial run in the US which showed that bisantrene was just as effective as the existing drugs at the time, which are still being used, but it's much more, much lower side effect profile, not only with damage to the heart, but also things like nausea, alopecia, which is loss of hair, these sorts of things that patients really don't like, and chemotherapeutics is not a very nice thing to go through. So the goal there really is to position bisantrene as the safer version of chemotherapeutics. So chemotherapeutics are still, even with all the advances in breast cancer, still the backbone of most treatment of most patients, particularly those with the aggressive, fast-growing triple-negative versions of breast cancer, and there's still a need for better versions of these drugs. Pillar 3, as Phil mentioned, is our kind of legacy program, and it builds on one of the areas where we have the most clinical evidence of that bisantrene is a very useful drug to use. So historically, bisantrene had a response rate around 40% in hard to treat relapsed or refractory AML patients, very difficult to treat cancer. And we also have more recent data out of the investigator-initiated trial run in Israel. That was a phase 2 trial, small trial, but it was single agent and gave a very clear signal that bisantrene could work in very difficult and very heavily pre-treated patients. And this is particularly in a subtype known as extramedullary AML. And extramedullary just means that the cancers escape the bone marrow and spread to somewhere else in the body, often under the skin, in various other organs like breast or the spleen, sometimes the brain, pretty much anywhere in the body some cancers can end up. And once that happens, the patients become very difficult to treat. Conventional treatments don't work. Experimental treatments are usually off limit to the patients as they're actively excluded from clinical trials. And one of the reasons for that is they are very hard to treat, and if you include them in your clinical trial, they can be, you can end up with a result that doesn't look quite as good as if you exclude them. So they're a population that needs, certainly needs increased and improved treatments. So why extramedullary? There's a number of different reasons. We have clinical need. So these are patients that aren't getting treated. They're a reasonably high percentage of patients, about 20% it's been discovered, of AML patients actually have the extramedullary form. The other thing that really was quite a surprise is out of the Israeli trial, we didn't exclude, or the investigators didn't exclude patients with extramedullary AML, unlike most trials. And 4 out of the 4 patients that responded in that trial all had the extramedullary form. And on the left-hand side, you can see a before and after PET scan of a patient that had extramedullary in the breast tissue. You can see all that dark space in the breast tissue. And then after 1 cycle of bisantrene, it was completely removed. And that's quite an amazing result there for that patient. One of the other big advantages we have is this particular pathway could come under the 505(b)(2) pathway for FDA approval. And that allows us to utilise historical data as though we'd collected it ourselves. So, as has been mentioned, it's been in many clinical trials. It's been in more than 6 clinical trials at the phase 2 level for AML. And all that data can be incorporated into and used to show safety and efficacy as though we'd collected it ourselves. So the next stage for this program is a full feasibility study to determine whether this is a viable opportunity for RACE, and if it is a viable opportunity, if it's the best opportunity under this legacy program. The other major program within Pillar 3 is the combination program. So we've done preclinical work to identify which combination of existing drugs that are now on the market, that weren't on the market in the 1980s, work best with bisantrene. And we've identified a combination that we potentially can take into the clinic and have a better version of than just giving bisantrene on its own. So we achieved a 40% response rate as a single drug in hard to treat relapsed and refractory AML, and we hope to be able to improve that by using the drugs in combination. And this is fairly standard in oncology these days. Almost all patients are treated with combinations of drugs rather than individual drugs. This has complications from a regulatory perspective. Obviously, when you move from a single agent to combinations of drugs, the requirements are the FDA rightly expects you to be able to show that your drug's effective, and so there needs to be careful consideration into the design of this trial before going forward and spending large amounts of shareholders' money. I should mention just before I move on is that both of those have the potential for paediatric AML treatments in the subtype that is different to adult, and that opens up the opportunity to attract the PRV, which we've been granted designation to, and that allows us to potentially pick up one of these PRVs which sell between 80 and 200 million US dollars, so potentially very valuable, and that's just granted with the actual with the drug. So the next process of Pillar 3 is to go through the process of feasibility. We're right in the middle of doing this feasibility study. It's a very complex and in-depth process. We basically have to develop a complete clinical program ready to go into the clinic to know that all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed, and that we don't run into any regulatory issues, we don't run into any clinical issues, we don't run into any scientific issues. We end up with a program that is fully costed, and we know exactly how much money we're going to spend in the shareholders' funds. MRD, I'll just mention briefly, was a program that was a major focus of the 5 pathway strategy. It's still a fantastic opportunity, but we basically have other opportunities which appear to be more exciting, faster, cheaper, and get us to our goal of approval and get bisantrene back onto the market in any indication. And so that will undergo internal feasibility study in 2021 with the aim of determining the priority of this program. And the same applies to the ovarian pathway. And that's also another great opportunity. Unfortunately, we're a small company and we can only do so many programs at once. And we have to make hard choices between programs, and some programs will move down in priority purely because we have other programs that are better or faster or cheaper. So what are some of the key events to look forward to in 2021 and 2022? So as Phil mentioned, 2020 has been an amazing year for RACE, not only scientifically and clinically, also from the perspective of the shareholders as well. But in 2021, you can expect that in Pillar 1, the FTO, we will see preclinical results that will determine whether bisantrene actually is a viable clinical drug. This opens up a lot of opportunities for partnering and also to be able to support doing clinical programs with an intention to begin those towards the end of 2021, beginning of 2022. Pillar 2 is further advanced because we've been working on this now for about a year. We've done the preclinical work and we're ready to start proof of concept clinical trials where we try and show that bisantrene actually is a safer version. And that will continue into 2022. So we'll have clinical trial results and progress occurring in 2021 in the Pillar 2 program. And then Pillar 3, we have the ability, these are very advanced programs, and the ability to rapidly move them into the clinic sometime in 2021. So the likelihood is we will either do one or both of those programs in either combination or in extramedullary, depending on the outcome of the feasibility. If it turns out that both are identified as being suitable, we'll take them both forward. They're in different populations, relatively low cost, and it allows us to increase the probability of success, but we may choose only to do one. Some of the near-term activities to expect in the first half of 2021, we should expect the preclinical programs to be underway and some of the initial results from those. We expect the breast cancer clinical trial design. This is already underway. It's been underway now for several weeks, and that has an estimated of 13 weeks, so we can expect early in the new year. We also have feasibility studies, the results of those feasibility studies to be also coming out at the beginning of calendar year 2021. So there is a series of news flow items to expect over the coming months. We're not just sitting around doing nothing in the meantime. So we're getting on with as fast as we possibly can the programs. And with that, I'll hand it back to Phil to talk more about the corporate side of things.
Thanks, Daniel, for that insightful review of strategy, and I hope it gives you a deeper understanding of why we've chosen those pillars, those priorities. We've clearly got significant clinical opportunities and we'll be working very hard to progress them. Daniel said, and I think I touched on this earlier, 2020 was a really big year of progress. So when you look at our corporate snapshot today, we're a very different Race Oncology than we were 12 months ago, or frankly even 6 months ago. So our market cap now is, in the region of circa $275 million. We've got a significantly larger shareholder base. We remain very tight on our share cap number. So we're not raising capital. We had a placement, of course, this year, 2020, but we remain very careful and considered about how we spend money, run very lean on cost control, and importantly, very focused on the choices we're going to make going forward on how we invest money. Our significant shareholders are still our founder, Bill Garner, and Daniel as well, who's a significant shareholder coming in to back us over 12 months ago. And we've got an institutional holding from Merchant Capital out of Perth. And we hope to be adding to our institutional investor base going forward, of course. So a lot of you, no doubt, are saying, well, what are we worth? What happens in the future? And you'd probably love me to sit here and say we're worth X or Y. I can't do that reasonably at the moment. What's important, I think, to you is that we're clear about understanding the market, where bisantrene fits, what indications, and therefore what choices we'll make strategically. That we as a team go out and execute those choices. And in the background, this slide is important because we will start to assess value based on our understanding of transactions externally that have happened around agents like ours, although no longer in a pure chemotherapeutic setting, but now in a much more targeted precision oncology space. So there's a number of specific tools that we can go after. They include such things as primary market research, where we can look at where we've got phase 2 type results. We can look at prescribing shares, approvable indications, prescribing trends in totality, and then try to attach economic value to what healthcare system economics can our drug drive in treatment. So that's one mechanism of creating value around specific indications. Equally, we're talking to pharma analysts who understand our space and the oncology space particularly. We'll do that both in Australia and internationally. We're connected through conferences, through the banking group that surrounds pharma opportunities like ours. So we're progressing that so that we'll have a view on valuation increasingly through 2021. And as you would expect, we'll start talking to the right partners. We are well networked as a group. When you look at this board, they've got health and pharma expertise, and we're going to deploy that to try to identify who are our potential partners going forward. So it's an exciting time, not only now, but going forward particularly. So as I summarize, and I've probably done this a couple of times, but it's appropriate, I think we've got a significant strategy pivot that's exciting. And it's exciting because it positions us centrally around FTO and around the precision oncology space. It takes us into solid tumor oncology and does so in a protein that exists across a number of cancer subsets. So that's exciting, I hope, for patients and ultimately for shareholders thereafter. There's a risk-reward ratio that is now transformed. We've still got a legacy chemotherapeutic positioning. We're differentiated, and that, if you like, protects fundamental value. But FTO, I hope, creates transformative value, and that's certainly what we're going to go after as a team. We know we've got the drug, we've got the opportunity, and increasingly got the access to not only our team, but a broader set of players that will help us to execute. Because execution's what this is all about. We've got a responsibility to ourselves and to you to make this happen, and we'll certainly do that. We will keep you informed. We're doing that today. So again, thanks to Daniel for sharing the stage today. But we'll keep you as informed as we can. When we've got news, and if it's substantive, we'll certainly let you know as it lands. But you have our commitment that we'll do everything we invest will be considered, we'll make the right choices, and we hope create continued success for Race Oncology. Thanks for your interest, and we look forward to communicating again with you in the future.